Suggestions that have something to do with my experience with specifically recitation and theater. Because if you're in theater, there are a couple of things that you would know that people often do wrong if they're trying to speak publicly. For instance, if you have a prepared speech, you never should sound like you're reading it. Why do you think that is? Or what's the alternative to sounding like you're reading when you're reading? Yes?
Because when you are reading the text, it doesn't sound like you believe in it. You are just like a robot and people don't like it.
Yes. So you're not actually communicating it. It's like you were in a bubble and you're talking just to yourself, or you feel completely emotionally disengaged from the text. Like it's just something that you're saying. It's not what you're communicating, if you get my drift. So one of the things is, even if you're completely prepared, you have it memorized, or you're actually reading it, what you need to do is to be acting it out. You need to be saying it in character, essentially. Even if it's a political speech or a debate, you are some kind of character, and you feel about what you're saying, and you should say it with that feeling. Which means that you should never say all of the text in exactly the same way. Because the word for that, I believe, is monotony. If you talk in a way when you don't change the tone of voice in which you speak, and you never really change anything about it, including the speed and everything else, then you probably are feeling already that if I talk like that, then I would feel like a robot and not like an actual person. But it happens to people that they just talk fast the whole time through, or they just talk slow the whole time through. Or they just talk quietly for all the time, or just talk at the same volume, same intonation, all the time. And then when they do that, then people are losing interest, and it's actually the failure of the speaker, not of the audience, because you cannot expect the audience to hold attention on something that is objectively boring. So, yeah, if you fall asleep during my lecture, it's my fault. It's fine. Then, of course, you can use dramatic pause, as I did just now. Dramatic pause is actually, it's a funny thing to think about, because most people, if they're nervous or not experienced public speakers, they will have a tendency to just keep speaking and speaking and speaking and speaking and never stopping at any time. I'm trying to stop at a time when I've made a point, so that you give the audience a few seconds to think about it. So that's, again, a very basic thing from something like recitation competition, because then that's what it is about. You have to have the text, but it is a text, but you shouldn't sound like you're reading it. You shouldn't be saying it all the same, all the time, and you need to be stopping at the points at which it is logical and makes sense to stop. And then, of course, it's more of a pro trick is if you listen to rappers. Does any of you listen to rap? Any kind of rap? Yeah. So raise your hand who listens to rap in some fashion, okay? Because rappers, for better and for worse, are the modern equivalent of poets at least in the public awareness. And what they do, if they're any good, they are speaking in verse. And English language is actually very much built around speaking in verse. If it's supposed to sound natural, if it's supposed to sound good. So there are examples that I could point to, and I think I will play you a little video at this point of little thing. Have you heard about epic rap battles? Yeah. Okay. Who of you has seen Edgar Allan Poe versus Stephen King? So that was a pretty competent demonstration of what you can do with verse. You can write something down that has a rhythm like that. You can do that, and it always works better. It's of course what you want to do is to get it to a level of improvisation. That at a certain level you will learn how to just improvise kind of verses when you're speaking. I'm not entirely sure because I'm not thinking about it, like I'm not realizing how much I'm doing it or what exactly it is as a verse, but I'm trying to speak in something that approaches a verse. That it has a certain rhythm and flow, those are the words. It has flow. Because if you're speaking, it should be something, if you write something down especially, that's like maybe a tip if you're a public speaker. If you write something down, you should write it and then try to read it before you go to make a speech about it. And you should try to figure out, if you're trying to read what you wrote, if it's easy to read. If it's not easy to read out loud, then you should rewrite it. Because that means that the rhythm is all wrong. Because then you're also making it hard for yourself, making it more likely that you will make an error, to trip over your tongue, as they say, if you write it in a way that's very difficult to read because the rhythm is very complicated. So these actually, they're not complicated, that's the beauty of it. Verse, the classical verses are actually the same sort of scheme of these accents, repeating on and on and on and on and on. And you just flow. You just flow in that single pattern. And that's something that's actually very easy to pronounce. Unless you make it super complicated like these guys because they wanted to show off in the epic rap battle. So you don't have to speak as fast as they did, or to make so many rhymes in it. Because that's the thing, most people when they think about poetry, they think rhyme. They don't think verse necessarily. But for speech, verse is more important than rhyme. If you start rhyming, then it becomes suspicious. People will be like, this is like a performance art or something. But if you're just using verses, they will just think it's normal good speech. Because it will flow, and so naturally it will be pleasant to listen to. What's important about it's called interpretation of text, or maybe you've heard it as recitation. I personally think it's a good thing to practice public speaking of all kinds, because debating is specific. Debating is about, as we've talked about before, or try it in an exercise, about argumentation, logic. It's more content-oriented. Poetry, or acting in general, is more style-oriented. And in debating, style is also important. In the verbatim debates that we will probably also try at a later point of this event, the style is also an equal part of the judge's evaluation, which is a slight difference from a lot of debating formats. So you could even lose a debate in a rebuttal on style, because this is supposed to teach you something about style. So you should be careful about preparing to also say it nicely. So one of the things is, because you can write something down beforehand, is, as I said, try to put it most simply. Try to write it down in a way that, if you then try to say it, sounds nice. It's very simple. Whatever you write down, and then if you read it out or say it, sounds nice, is well written. That's it. It could be any kind of verse whatsoever that exists. You can invent some new ones, who knows. The point is, just try to make it sound nice. And to connect it with the video, well, that's why I specifically chose the one with Edgar Allan Poe, rapper. Though in the most famous poem from Edgar Allan Poe, there is a number of times that the word rapping is actually used, though in a different meaning. Then, could you tell me what is, if you know it, what is the most famous poem from Edgar Allan Poe?
Raven.
The Raven, of course. So who of you knows The Raven? Yeah, it's quite a popular poem. It's maybe the most popular poem in English language. And I think it's great for demonstration of what I'm trying to tell you, like how, if you approach text carefully, you can figure out how to say it. So these are a few tricks on how, based on what you see written down, to get some pointers on how to say it, and then if you turn it around, how to write something down so that it's nice when you say it out loud. So just to compare it, this poem begins, The Raven begins, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary." If you remember, the rapping began, "Once upon a midnight dreary, as I spit this, weak and weary." So he clearly just chose to use exactly the same verse. It's exactly the same thing. And this is just one of the many possible verses. So if I, for demonstration, to read you a paragraph or two of the poem, or to say it better, not to read it, or definitely not sound like I am reading it, which is something that's generally killing people's interest in poetry. If they're being forced to listen to poetry that somebody is just reading, then it's really boring. It's hopefully less boring if you then interpret the text and try to say it in a way that sounds good. I'll try that, taking the breath, so that I don't start without it. "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books the seas of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. So that's just to demonstrate that if you write something in a verse, it can sound nice. And that's the thing, it's not super difficult. To do it in a simple way, it's not super difficult. If you're looking at a text, for instance, that you're supposed to say publicly, because public speaking doesn't have to be just debating. Public speaking could be recitation. Public speaking could be that you have a text and you're supposed to, read it. So maybe you have some sort of gathering of like a club in which you are. It doesn't have to be debating. It could be sports club, or could be some like event at your school, and you want to be the speaker for your class, for instance, and to speak in front of people. You will generally have a speech written down. And if you see a speech written down, then if you read it, you can see by how it's written some pointers on how it's supposed to be said. For example, this one is written in verse, and you could say at the point where the first paragraph ends and the second begins, only this and nothing more, ends one paragraph. And the next one begins, ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December. Why do you think there's ah at the beginning? It's a weird thing to do, right? Just because it's written there. A-H, there's like ah at the beginning. Why it's there? Because if you say it without it, it doesn't work in the verse. If you say it without it, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, it sounds worse than if you put it there. Ah, distinctly I remember. There's a difference in the rhythm, just by if you put that syllable there or not. So probably, when Edgar Allan Poe was writing it, he just wrote, with a general idea. He wanted to say that he distinctly remembers, but then once he wrote distinctly I remember, he realized he can't just say it like that, because it doesn't work in the verse. So what can I do? Oh, I just put ah at the beginning. And then I get, then the verse is rolling. So that's a very simple thing to do. And generally you would see, for instance, where to make a pause. It's not so with English necessarily, but if you see a comma, then it's possible that at that point something ends and it's before some other block of the text begins. So maybe, this is a general rule of thumb, if you have to do pauses, then maybe either do them like at the end of a sentence, of course, or do them maybe in the middle of a sentence if you need the time to breathe. Do them at a comma. For instance, one example where it's broken by something, it could be broken by something else, it could be broken by a dash, it doesn't have to be broken by a comma, it's just broken up by something. Then you could say something like, from my books surcease of sorrow. Well, it begins, it's already a continuation of a previous sentence. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, and there's a dash in the middle of a line. And this insert, sorrow for the lost Lenore, is in dashes, so it's clearly separate. So it's good to make pause before and at the end of that segment. From my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore. Again, so you make pauses at the places where generally it's indicated. If it's written by anyone who knows how to write in English language, then there will be indications when to make a pause. So that's a simple thing that you don't even have to, even if you don't prepare for the text, you can see it as you're reading it, and as you're reading it just without much thinking, just following these simple things. Think, oh, there's a period at the end of a sentence, so maybe I should drop my voice down. So those are very simple things, and the basic skills if you ever want to do theater, or especially focus on the vocal part of theater, on the recitation or interpretation.